Hey guys, this is week 2 of our Christian apologetics series, and I just want to review before we start on this week's what we talked about briefly last week. Last week we talked about what apologetics is and how it helps us answer rationally the big questions in life, like where did we come from, what is the purpose of life. And we also talked about the 4 different worldviews out there and how we can use abductive reasoning to make an educated guess on the best, most possible, or most plausible answer. And then we saw how we need to examine the evidence to make an educated or intelligent decision on which one is most likely to be true. This week we'll begin to examine discoveries in astronomy and science that will give us really strong evidence to point to a creator God. Well, in recent society, in the last 10 years or so, there has been a new movement called the New Atheists. Authors like Richard Dawkins here has written books. This one's called The God Delusion. It's really topping bestseller lists. It's all over the social media, all over television, and they have big conferences that are widely attended. And so this new atheism really isn't new. They're not really saying anything new, but they're actually much more open and much more derisive in their put down of Christians and theists. So it actually is not any kind of new discoveries that they're adding to their theories. So this topic is really, really important because it's everywhere in our society today. There are actually many other scientists in history, throughout history, John Ray, Kepler, Galileo, Newton. You may recognize some of these names. They're all really prominent scientists that actually saw science and scientific discoveries as all pointing to an intelligent design, not a atheistic, self-directed design. So how did this atheistic worldview start? Before the 1800s, really, pretty much everybody or most of the population believed in some sort of theism. Before then, they either believed in like a pantheistic God or they believed in a single God that had created the universe. In the early 1800s, a physicist named Pierre Laplace, he postulated an origin of the universe using scientific theories and the laws of gravity they had discovered, and he postulated that the universe could have started with no intelligent design, but just happened on its own. Also, in another part of science, the geologists started giving possible explanations of the origins of great designs of the earth, like mountains and canyons, and they postulated that they were slow, self-directed processes that created these. And then thirdly, a prominent biologist, Charles Darwin, about in the 1850s, he started a new theory of the origin of life by processes of natural selection. If you see the picture there in the right-hand corner, you'll see that at the very bottom left is modern man, and if you go back, follow it back all the way to the very top left, you'll see that he postulated that it all arose from a single cell organism. Here is a little clip to watch. Okay, so that clip was just a fun little animation of what the proposed theories of evolution are. But of course, that clip was not, it was just like a reenactment of Darwin's theory of evolution. But we know that, humans, or they don't postulate that humans arose from dogs or anything. So we're not trying to make fun of atheists, okay? But just remember that the gist of it is that we arose from non-intelligent beings, which arose from single-cell organisms. And single-cell organisms, they propose, arose from simple chemicals. And the chemicals arose from elementary particles like carbon and oxygen. So the question is, where did the elementary particles come from? Well, the atheist answer at this time was that they were there all the time. They postulated a universe that was static, and which means that it was always there. The world always had elementary particles, therefore all those things just happened on its own, and it wasn't created, it was always there. It just evolved into more complex things with time. The theist answer, of course, is that the elementary particles were created by God and directed to grow into more advanced beings. So the materialism worldview, or the atheist worldview, was that from eternity were particles. The particles became complex and became alive. This living stuff became aware, and then this aware living stuff conceived of a God. So that's a summary, a summary of the materialistic worldview. Of course, the theistic worldview is that God existed first, and God, apart from the universe, created matter. So just to review, the materialist view of the universe was that it was eternal, self-existent, self-creating, self-organizing, and autonomous, which means that it didn't get any help from any outside sources. Okay? So the eternal is really important there. Well, what happened was in the 1920s, the early 1920s, they discovered a new scientific discovery that really shook that belief to its core. A scientist named Edwin Hubble, you may have heard of him, of the Hubble telescope. Well, he was an astronomer that built a telescope powerful enough to examine the stars up close. And what they found was just groundbreaking. They found that the stars that they saw, or the little points of light that they saw in the sky, weren't actually stars. They were actually galaxies made up of millions of stars. And some of those stars that when they looked up even closer, were other galaxies. So the sky was just an infinite collection of galaxies and stars that were innumerable. Just to explain Hubble's discovery, we'll have to kind of talk about this scientific law. Okay, so this is called the Doppler effect, and I'll explain later how it really showed their discovery to be groundbreaking. So the Doppler effect applies to both sound and light. So many of you might have heard of the Doppler effect with sound. So if you hear an ambulance who's emitting a siren and it's moving towards you, the sound waves get compressed and it becomes a higher pitched sound that you hear. See the little man on the left? Versus if it was moving away from you, the sound waves get wider and the sound becomes lower pitched. Well, it has the same effect on actually light. So if the light is coming towards you, the light will emit on the blue color scale, because that's just the properties of light. When the wavelengths are shorter, it turns blue. And when light is, the light waves are wider, it looks reddish to your eye. So what this means for the Hubble telescope is that when they started looking closer at the galaxies in the sky with this powerful telescope, they realized that these, not only were there infinite galaxies, these galaxies, the further out they were moving away from us. So at an increased rate, the further out they were. What does this tell us? Is really, really critical. The further away the galaxies were, the faster they were moving away from us. And this was revolutionary because it pointed to a universe that was not static like they had originally thought, but it was expanding. And that means an expanding universe means that if you go backwards in time, that means it had to have a single point of origin. They called this a red universe because of all the red spots that they saw up in the sky the further away they were. So this expanding universe theory points, like I said, to a point origin, and this was revolutionary to scientists. So instead of having an eternal static universe, you have this expanding finite universe. Finite in that it means it had a starting point. So this is also really interesting. Albert Einstein, a few years before Hubble's discoveries, actually discovered this theory of an expanding universe simply by use of mathematics and his theory of relativity. He realized that a large mass produces a force of contraction of the space around it. But because of the force of expansion that from I'm sorry, let me read this real quick. There is an opposing force of expansion that was slightly higher than this and concluded that the universe must be expanding. But you have to realize that Einstein was a staunch atheist. So he didn't like this theory because Einstein realized that would point to a finite universe, which means it had to have a beginning instead of an eternal universe like the atheist had proposed earlier. So what he did was this. He said, the math is pointing to the wrong conclusion. I don't like this conclusion, so I will add my own constant. So he made up what was called a cosmologic force constant. He said there must be a force that must be contracting the universe at the same rate that the universe wants to expand, so that the universe stays at a steady state level. Now, when Einstein, a few years later, hears about Hubble's discoveries, he is obviously very surprised, because there now is irrefutable evidence that the universe is expanding. He says that, quote, the cosmologic force of expansion was the biggest mistake of my scientific career. So he was trying to fit the science to match his atheistic views. And he even says that I now see the necessity of a beginning of the universe. So, safe to say that all the atheists that previous to the Hubble discoveries, once they heard about what was now irrefutable proof that the universe was expanding, how did they take this? You see here, this is an example of a scientist, Sir Arthur Stanley Eddington. He states, quote, Philosophically, the notion of a beginning of the present order is repugnant to me. Repugnant means that he really doesn't like it. He finds it very distasteful. I should like to find a genuine loophole. I simply do not believe the present order of things started off with a bang. The expanding universe is preposterous. It leaves me cold. So, it is not taken very well by the scientists at this time, especially the ones that were atheists. Here's an example of another atheist scientist and what he had to say. He says, Robert Dick says that an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of understanding the origin of matter at any finite time in the past. Basically, he's saying that if the universe was infinite, we wouldn't have to explain a beginning. But because the opposite is true, they were very stumped as to how that could fit in with their worldview. So that's the conclusion of this week's lesson. We'll talk about more in depth at Sabbath school what this expanding universe means, and talk about it more in our discussion groups. See you guys this Saturday.